Hello everyone, it's Christina from Our Wood Home. I'm going to be taking you along today as I use my pressure canner for the very first time. I was getting ready to edit this video and realized I forgot to do an intro segment, so that's why I'm doing it now on my couch indoors, looking maybe a little bit rough because it's allergy season and it's not a fun experience. But anyways, I hope that you enjoy this video. It's a little bit different. I wasn't able to film much audio while I was actually filming the video clips because I was doing this whole process outside and it was very noisy. So I'll be doing voiceover to explain a little bit about what's going on in each clip. And I will let you know my thoughts about this whole process at the end of the video. I'm pretty sure I also forgot to film that clip, so I'll probably come to you either looking like this or just doing it over voiceover. Anyways, let's get into that video. I received this pressure canner a few years ago for my birthday, and I've been afraid to use it because I just didn't know much about them. They're kind of intimidating, and I don't know anybody else that pressure cans. After doing some research, I realized if I wanted to can my homegrown corn, it had to be done in a pressure canner. A water bath or steam canner just wasn't going to be suitable. So I figured now is as good a time as any to learn how to use this thing. I read my manual multiple times and I felt like I was fairly confident in using it. Just in case anybody wants to know, my pressure canner I think it's the 22 quart and it's the Miro by Tefal. It's a weighted gauge, it's not a dial. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'll show the gauge a little bit later. I am not confident in explaining how exactly they work or what the difference is, but I would imagine the other style, the dial, is a little bit easier to use than the weighted gauge. If you have experience using both of these styles, please let me know which you find is easier. My pressure canner is brand new. I've never used it for pressure canning, but I have used it as just a large water pot, and that's why there's some staining on the inside. This is apparently totally normal, it's safe, it doesn't affect the integrity of the pot. So if you see some dirty looking things in my pot, just know that's totally normal. I decided to just raw pack my corn in my hot jars. I didn't bother cooking it beforehand, but I did fill them with hot water according to canning safety standards. I can't remember the exact website I used, but I will link it in the description of this video if you wanted to see that. This is my pressure canner setup outside. I know it's kind of hard to see. I'm on the deck because I can't use this type of pressure canner on my smooth top stove, so this seemed to be the best option. I've got a propane burner here connected to a tank there, and I've just got my canner on top. I know a lot of pressure canners can be used on ceramic or glass stoves, but mine is not one of them. I don't know if that means that the heat just isn't effective with that type of stove for this type of canner, or if the concern is maybe that the weight of the canner would break the stovetop. Either way, I wasn't about to experiment with that, so I ended up using this outdoor propane burner of my husband's. I think it's actually from his turkey deep fryer, but I could be mistaken. Anyways, it was a perfect fit. He just set it up for me on the upper deck just outside the kitchen. And this worked out pretty well. It definitely has its flaws. To begin with, it was exposed to the elements, and my manual says that the canner should not be exposed to any type of draft, so I'm assuming they also mean any type of wind is not ideal. Thankfully, it seemed to be okay. If I was using this canner on a propane kitchen stove, I wonder if I would have had the same problem with my pot as I did using this outdoor burner. My pot ended up being completely warped on the bottom after first use. It was curved, so it wasn't flat anymore. I think that's because of the extreme direct heat right on the bottom of the pot. So now even if I wanted to use it on an indoor stove that was safe, I don't think I could because it's not flat anymore. This apparently isn't a huge problem according to my internet research, but it's still something to be aware of if you decide to pressure can this way. Another thing that happened was the pot got a little bit scraped on the outside from the support bracing on the burner. I didn't realize that would happen. I don't think it's going to be a big deal. It's just a cosmetic flaw, but that's also something to consider. I have this burner set up in a fairly sheltered area, but we get a lot of wind, and even though I tried to can on a day that was not windy, there was definitely a little breeze. Since this was my first time using a pressure canner, I tried to do as much research as possible, but admittedly it was still a little bit confusing. I followed the manual and tried to look up some tutorials for using this specific canner, but I wasn't entirely confident. Since I had never done this before, I didn't really know what to expect and what was considered to be normal, especially since I'm using this in a less than ideal environment since it's outside. But I tried my best, and I definitely made some errors, which I learned after the fact. Thankfully, no harm was done, and I was able to safely reprocess my corn, and it's still shelf stable now. It hasn't had any problems, and it's been sitting in the basement for a few weeks. But I made a few crucial errors, which I'll explain throughout this video. I think error number one is not fully understanding the weighted gauge and also using the wrong weighted gauge. So I'm supposed to use a 10 psi gauge for pressure canning corn, and I accidentally used a 15. I'm not sure that in itself was enough to create potential problems, but since I was using the wrong weight and I wasn't entirely sure what it was supposed to look like when it was operating optimally, I think that affected the pressure inside and resulted in a loss of liquid from my jars while they were processing. I had suspected that the jars were leaking during the canning. I actually smelled a really sweet steam coming out of it, sweet like corn, and I was so afraid the jars had broken, but I didn't hear any shattering or cracking, so I just hoped that they would be okay once the time had finished. These processed for 55 minutes of active processing time, not including the time for the canner to get to the right pressure and then for the cool down time after. So I was sitting there for over an hour just hoping my jars would be okay. I had the burner up way too high for this stove, so it was putting out too much heat and causing the canner to have to release pressure more often than it should. So that's why it was steaming and jiggling and causing quite the ruckus. I didn't know that it wasn't supposed to do this, so lesson learned. I needed to learn how to also control the heat on this burner because it was my first time using the burner as well, which in hindsight was error number two. I should have familiarized myself with the canner and the burner before attempting to use it. As you can see though, my corn came out looking pretty good, no broken jars, definitely a lot of liquid inside the pot that had escaped from the jars. And I wondered, how is this even possible? Because I made sure my jars and my lids were nice and hot, and then I used hot water to fill the jars. So in theory, that should have created a nice tight seal during the processing. And that's true, but because the pressure was constantly having to release in the canner due to using likely the wrong weight and too high of a heat on the stove, the liquid was siphoning out from the jars. So once the jars were completely full when I put them in, they ended up losing about half or more of their liquid. And from what I could tell through research, it would have been okay to leave the jars as is, but any corn outside of the water, above the water line that is, might have turned brown and would have just been unappealing but still fine to eat. But there was concern that maybe it's not the safest if it's lost more than half its water. So I decided to do this whole process again the next day, and that worked out a lot better. I didn't have any more leaking. Once I had processed my second batch of corn, I decided I was ready to try something new, so I went to get some peas and beans from the garden. These were all fresh, none of them were dried yet, so I felt like it was safe to can those. Beans and peas can process for the same amount of time according to my research, so I did some jars of beans and some jars of peas. again with a raw pack, just filling them with hot water up until about 1/2 inch of space. And I attempted to use my pressure canner again outside. It went a lot better because I knew what I had done wrong previously and attempted to correct all those errors. For example, I made sure I used the proper weighted gauge, 10 pounds. I also figured out the ideal setting for the propane burner, so I was able to get that pretty consistently with the heat. And I also did some more research on my weighted gauge and learned that this specific model is supposed to jiggle and release pressure 3 to 4 times per minute, so I made sure I was timing it to see that it was functioning properly. If it was constantly releasing pressure, then I knew I'd have a problem with the liquid siphoning out again, and I did not want that to happen. So I'm very happy that it all worked out well, and I ended up with some nice jars of beans and peas. I'm not entirely sure what kind of beans these are, so I decided to shell them because the pod itself isn't very good to eat when they're mature. So I figured by shelling them, I'm going to get the best tasting bean. I know you can green beans, but I know these are not green beans, so I didn't go that route. Since this was my 3rd time using the canner in a matter of days, I felt pretty confident and I was able to follow all the steps correctly and end up with nicely sealed jars of beans and peas. One thing I was not expecting was that the beans and peas would change color during the pressure canning process to be sort of a brownish color, and they actually looked exactly like beans that you'd buy in a can from the grocery store. I show that in my previous video about what I preserved for the month of August. So if you wanted to check that out, it'll be linked at the end of this video. One of the reasons I was so hesitant to use my pressure canner previously is because it just seems really scary. It's a big pot full of pressurized water and steam that could potentially explode and harm me. At least that's what I thought. I have never even used an Instant Pot, which is a miniature pressure cooker, because that seems scary. And I've heard stories of those exploding, but I think in all those cases, it's user error. So when I was reading through my manual for my pressure canner, I realized it has this cool feature to prevent any type of mishap like that. If you look on the video screen, you'll see a close-up picture of one of the handles and a little red button on the top. The handles actually slide into place so that if it doesn't fit correctly, you know that the lid isn't on properly. This little red button is a safety feature that prevents the pot from actually being opened while that is engaged. So that means that it's pressurized and it's not safe to open, and it literally will not let you open the lids. I found that to be a really comforting feature, and once the pressure has gone down, that little button pops back underneath the handle and you can't see it anymore, so you know it's safe to take off. I have been doing a fair bit of pressure canning over the last couple weeks, and I'm feeling a lot more confident with it. It's not as scary as I thought if you read the manual, familiarize yourself with all the equipment, and use properly tested recipes. As I said earlier, I will link the recipe for the corn and the beans in the description of this video, so if you wanted to make that, you can see what recipe and method I used. Pressure canning isn't as scary as I thought it would be, and honestly, I'm kind of disappointed that I didn't try this sooner because, like I said, I've had this pressure canner for a few years, and I could have been pressure canning so many things. But now that I know what to do, I can feel more confident pressure canning a variety of foods and even some soups and stews, hopefully, to last throughout the winter. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know in the comments, and if you have any tips for using a pressure canner, I would love to know those as well. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this video. I hope that you have a great rest of your day.